Good evening, gentlemen. Good evening. We are holding near the end of the second chapter of the Holy Tanya. We are going to be, God willing, concluding the second chapter today. We are in the middle of discussing the nature of the godly soul. The godly soul, which is literally a piece of God above, that every Jew, from the greatest and most righteous tzaddik to the lowliest and most ignorant person who doesn't even attend our Thursday night class, every single one of them has a piece of God above, which is their godly soul. Last week we continued discussing how even though all the godly souls come from the same place and the same origin and the same root, they nevertheless differ and have differing qualities because they go through a process of divine differentiation in the divine centrifuge, where each one of them comes down through different worlds with different aspects and has different qualities as a result. We explained that even though some godly souls are very, very insensitive to godliness because of this process where they come down through all the worlds and become distanced from their own nature, nevertheless, at the end of the day, or good afternoon, I guess, in the new time slot. The Jew is literally a piece of God. The Jew cannot be separated from godliness, as we said, quoting the Alter Rebbe's words in the Hayom, a Yid niter vil, niter ken sein, chas v'shalom, abgerissen von Elokus. A Jew does not want and cannot be separated from godliness. To separate a Jew from godliness is to separate a thing from itself. The godly soul is a piece of God. It cannot be separated from Hashem. But that is all in its essential nature. That's all in what in Chassidus, as we discussed last week, is called etzem, in its very self, in its true, essential, fundamental, inherent, indelible nature. Whereas when you're talking about giluyim, when you're talking about what's expressed or experienced or what we are aware of, that's a different story. And awareness is where the godly soul can become very, very distant from its source. And therefore, God did us a favor, and He gave us the tzaddikim, the Talmidei Chachamim, and the Rebbes in every generation, the leaders of the Jewish people of that time, who remind us and who wake us up to our own inner divine reality. A Jew is always connected. It's the role of the Rebbe, the Tzaddik, the Talmid Chacham, to reveal the nature of that connection and to bring it into awareness and to wake up the godly soul, to bring its powers, to bring its true nature forth into expression and into awareness. This is in fitting with the Alter Rebbe's metaphor, where the Alter Rebbe says that the toenail of the son is still connected to the deepest self of the father, but in multiple ways. On the one hand, there's what it is. Its very substance is made up of the deepest self of the father, which is like the etzem of the soul, that what it is godliness. And there's also the fact that the toenail of the son is still connected to a brain, is still connected to a self. Not the self of the father, but actually the self of the son. But nevertheless, because it is connected to a self, therefore, because it's connected to the brain of the son, therefore it remembers how to connect to the brain of the father, or what it's like to be part of the mind of the father, is the Alter Rebbe's metaphor. And this is what a tzaddik or a rebbe is. The second chapter of Tanya says that a real rebbe, a real tzaddik, a real talmid chacham, a leader of the Jewish people in their generation, they are like the brain of the son, that no matter how differentiated and how dead and how insensitive the godly soul may become, it retains a connection to and is an expression of godliness as manifest on earth, as manifest, as so to speak, as part of its own body, the body of the son, right, which is the tzaddik and the rebbe and the leader of every generation. And all of this whole metaphor we explained at much greater length last week. Okay, I want to continue and read more because we didn't finish reading what I wanted to read last week. So we will read more and we will make it into some new stuff as well, right here at the end of the chapter. It's interesting because the end of the chapter, not the words we're about to read, but in a couple of sentences, the end of the chapter was not in the original handwritten version of the Tanya. It was added later for printing, which is one of the interesting facts. I'm not very knowledgeable about the different versions of Tanya, which is a fascinating and very complicated topic. But when I do run into information about it, I will share it with you. So it's interesting that the end of the second chapter was a little bit later, was not in the original handwritten form, but was rather added from the Alter Rebbe when it first went to publish, it seems. So we'll see what that's all about, and maybe we'll speculate wildly as to why that is and why it was added, maybe in a little bit. But for now, we are in the Book of the Holy Tanya, in the second chapter, page 12 in the Hebrew, page 8 in the straightforward English translation. We are up to Ubazeh. It's literally the last word on the page. That's why I couldn't find it. Literally the last word on the page. It's the last word in the English as well. You see a paragraph begins with this. Literally the only word in that paragraph at the end of page 8. In the Hebrew, the last word on the page, Ubazeh. Ubazeh Yuvan. Says the Tanya Kadisha, the Holy Tanya, the words of the Alter Rebbe. Ubazeh Yuvan Maimer Razal. And through this meaning, through the role of the Rebbe and the Tzaddik and the Talmid Chacham as the intermediary through which the godly soul is awoken and gets its sustenance. And every godly soul, we mentioned, by the way, I forgot to mention in the review, that even those who oppose receiving their divine beneficence through Rebbe, even those who are unaware that they rely on the tzaddikim, still rely on them because that's the source of their divine beneficence, right? Since this is the established role, the way God sets up the godly soul, that the godly soul will needs to receive its sustenance through the leaders of its generation, which are the brain-to-brain connection with God, as opposed to the tonel, which is the lowly neshamas. So, by understanding this concept of the role of the Rebbe, the Tzaddik, and the Talmid Chacham, Yuvan Maimer Razal, we understood a statement of the sages. Al pasuk, on the verse, Uladavka bay, cleave to him. Shakol hadavik b'Talmid Chacham ma'ale alav hakasuv ki'ilu nidbak b'shchina mamash. Anyone who cleaves to a Talmid Chacham, to a Torah scholar, the verse considers it as if he cleaves to the Shechina, to the presence of God, literally. We already discussed this last week. We just didn't read it. Last week we were discussing how this statement of the sages is very mysterious without the understanding of Chassidus and Kabbalah, because it's not clear why any Joe Schmo from the street who simply attaches themselves to a Talmid Chacham, it's like they're attaching themselves to God. You would think, logically speaking, rationally speaking, that if the Talmid Chacham is connected to God because of the Torah that he learns, then you shouldn't connect to God through connecting to him, which is only a secondary or a second-hand connection. You should connect to God by learning Torah yourself, educate yourself. You start out knowing nothing. The goal should not be to attach yourself to a Talmid Chacham, it should be to become a Talmid Chacham, right? And furthermore, how is it that you can say that attaching yourself to a Talmid Chacham is attaching yourself to God, right? Isn't there an obvious step down from that attachment? Isn't the Talmid Chacham only an intermediary? And so we explained that traditionally in Judaism, as we discussed last week, there's two ways of interpreting this. There's the pre-Chassidic way and the Chassidic way. The pre-Chassidic way of understanding this is that basically the lives of normal people are less important than the lives of a Talmid Chacham, and that basically by attaching yourself to a Talmid Chacham, you fulfill perhaps the only purpose which you have on earth, and therefore, because you're fulfilling the divine purpose, you could say that in a sense you're attached to God, in a certain sense, to the extent that this view believes attachment to God is even possible, but that's a different discussion for a different time. The Hasidic view, of course, says exactly the opposite, that every single Jew has an infinite connection to God that no one can add to and no one can detract from, that's absolutely perfect, and that you don't need anyone else, God forbid, to connect to God. On the contrary, your very essence is absolutely divine and totally united with God. You can't be separated from God. Rather, what is the point of cleaving to the Talmid Chacham? The point of cleaving to the Talmid Chacham is to cleave to the Shechina, is to bring that essential attachment into awareness. The Shechina is the presence of God, right? To bring out that essential connection, to cleaving to the Talmid Chacham allows a person to reveal, express, and become aware of their fundamental infinite connection to God. It's not that the Talmid Chacham is, so to speak, closer and you're further. That's not the dynamic, and thereby this teaching is explained. Because through cleaving to the Talmid Chacham, to the Torah scholar, the nefesh, ruach, and neshama, the various levels of the Jew's godly soul, even of the Amei Haaretz, even of an ignorant Jew who doesn't know anything about Torah, is united with its original essence and its original source, which is in the supernal wisdom. Shehu Yisbarich v'Chochmasai Echad, and God and His blessed wisdom are absolutely one, as we said already earlier in the chapter of Amada, and he is his knowledge. He's the knower, the knowledge, and the known, right? So by talking to the tzaddik, one reveals and remembers and awakens the essential connection to God that is the very being of the godly soul. This attachment is to God's wisdom, which is its original source. And of course, God's wisdom is nothing other than in total unity with God Himself. So by cleaving to a Talmid Chacham, the Jew is made aware of and brings out their fundamental connection to God. They achieve that fundamental connection. They reveal their latent ability to connect to God Himself, because it's the original source of their own soul. I'd like to just take a moment and note that the Alter Rebbe keeps using the term Talmid Chacham, which means a Torah scholar. And of course, when the Gemara says Torah scholar, Talmid Chacham, the Alter Rebbe would argue it doesn't just mean someone that knows a lot of Torah, right? And of course, when we say that the person cleaves to a Talmid Chacham, they're cleaving to the presence of God, we don't mean that any random person who studies a lot of Talmud, right, accomplishes this. And in fact, the Hasidic reading of the term Talmid Chacham, which literally means a student of wisdom, right, or a wise student, a sagely student, right? The Talmid Chacham is the person who connects to the trait of Chachma, which, as we'll see for the Alter Rebbe, Chachma is the byword, is the name of all the soul's infinite powers that are super rational, such as faith and repentance and self-sacrifice and the acceptance of the will of the yoke of heaven and all of these other things. These are all Chachma, right? A Chacham, it says. Ezo Chacham Hareyas HaNeilad is a famous Talmud, which means who is wise, the one who sees what is being born, right? So there's lots of ways you can interpret this, right? I think the simplest interpretation of the pshat of the statement is that a wise person is someone who sees what's coming. He sees what's coming down the pike, right? He sees what's now, and he sees what's going to be born from it. That's what makes a person wise. A wise person has seen this movie before. He knows what's going to happen. He based on what he sees now, he can predict. He can see what's coming, right? But the Hasidic reading is as many Hasidic readings are, is in a way the same, but in another sense much more profound. It's the same idea, but taken to its most godly, utmost height, which is the idea that the Talmid Chacham, the Chacham who sees what's being born, Chassidus teaches, is a person who sees the something constantly being born from the nothing. The yesh constantly emerging from the ayin, right, is what it means to see what's being born. In other words, the Talmid Chacham is a person who is utterly aware of the absolute nullification of all reality to God, which is the ultimate seeing of what's born, right? Of relating the thing to its source and to its ultimate cause, right? That's a real chacham. A chacham sees through, a wise person, a sage, sees through the superficial presentation, especially in our world, where things are just what they are, right? Where it is what it is, and he sees through to the ultimate roots of all realities, which in our world, everything is a yesh, everything is a something, and it's all rooted in nothing. So that's what we mean when we say, when the Alter Rebbe says Talmid Chacham, right? The Alter Rebbe would tell you that a Talmid Chacham is not just someone who learns a lot of Torah. Although learning a lot of Torah is very important, as we will see in chapter 5 of Tanya, God willing. Continues the Holy Alter Rebbe. Any questions so far? I'll take a coffee break. Says the Holy Alter Rebbe in the brackets. We're now about 4 lines down on page Zion. In the English, I assume there's brackets as well. Yes. As for those, halfway down the first column on page 10. Says the Alter Rebbe parenthetically in the brackets, the intentional sinners and those who rebel against the Talmidei Chachamim. In other words, what if the Jew is not on board? What if the Jew says, no thank you, I'm not interested in being attached to a tzaddik, they creep me out, I'll do it my own way, not interested, right? Have my own ideas. Yenikas nefesh ruach neshama shalahem bechinas acharayim shel nefesh ruach neshama Talmidei Chachamim. Their Yenika, which is an interesting word, their suckle. Yenika is what a baby does when it eats. Is Yenika? It's suckle, right? It's receiving of power. We'll discuss that term in a second. Of their soul comes from the acharayim, comes from the back or the hind quarter of the nefesh ruach and neshama, of the soul of the Talmid Chacham. In other words, the choice, and this is very Chassidish, is the choice is not the choice of the outcome, right? There's no choice on outcome, right? You have a godly soul. Your godly soul gets its abilities, gets its connection, its overt connection to God, right? All through the tzaddikim of your generation. There's only one choice. The choice is are you going to accept it? Or are you going to be dragged kicking and screaming? That's the choice, right? And really in Chassidus, that's the whole choice of life, is the whole of life's like that, right? In other words, as you may have heard attending this synagogue, Mashiach is coming, right? Mashiach is coming. The world, everyone's going to do tshuva. The world is going to be perfected and as a home for God, and God's going to be revealed. None of that is up for discussion. That's not the choice. That's not the choice you've been given by God. The only choice is: are you going to be a conduit for it? Are you going to be a means by which it happens, or are you going to be dragged kicking and screaming? Right? It's the only two. Choices. So similarly here, the choice is only whether you receive from the tzaddik face to face, which is the way you want to receive it. And this whole distinction between receiving from behind versus face to face comes up a little bit later. This is not where it's famous from in Tanya. It's more famous when we discuss the klipa and discussing the nature of klipa in I believe chapter 6, where it's called mandash shadei basar kasfui, someone who gives something over his shoulder as he would to his enemy, right? Is how God gives sustenance to the klipa, right? So you can receive your sustenance from a Talmid Chacham and from the tzaddikim of your generation in that way if you prefer, right? Or you can receive it face to face, and there's much in Chassidus and the difference between being back to back versus face to face. It's actually a very profound and extensive matter. But the bottom line is that's the choice. Everybody receives their sustenance. Every godly soul, when a Jew does a mitzvah on earth, they receive the ability and the spiritual sustenance of their godly soul to partake in that and partake in a divine act in all the senses that only the godly soul really knows what that means. They receive the ability to do that from the tzaddikim, the Talmidei Chachamim, the leaders of their generation. And when a Jew anywhere in the world does a mitzvah, in a way, they are one way or another participating in the leaders and the godly souls who lead their generation. The term Yanika, which I said I would make a note on, he says the Alter Rebbe doesn't say they receive their vitality, which the Alter Rebbe could say. He says they receive their chayos from Talmidei Chachamim. He says they receive their Yanika, their suckling, which is the term normally used for klipa. Right, that's why there's this distinction, because the undesirable things the ultimately undesirable things that are nevertheless temporarily desirable for reasons known to God, right? That is the existence of evil, negativity, negative forces, the concealment of the divine. They don't have true vitality, because true vitality in Chassidus, and really this is a very profound matter. This is a window into something way above our pay grade in this class. But the real vitality in Chassidus, real chayos, is something which is totally and completely united with a being. And because Klippa is essentially rejecting of its own nature, because the nature of Klippa is denial, the nature of things that conceal or rebel against God, or tzaddikim or Talmidei Chachamim, is to deny their own true nature, they can never really have true chayas, they can never really have true vitality, they can only have suckling, which is you should think of like a leech, that's the image you should have, right? They can only be parasitical on life, but they can't be alive themselves, right? Their source of life is always above them. This is why in Kabbalah, when it discusses the corresponding negative traits corresponding to the 10 spheres, it talks about the 11 crowns, because in the 10 spheres, their light and their vitality is united with them, so there's only 10, whereas the 11 crowns of evil, the 11 crowns of Klippa, there's 10 of them corresponding to the 10 spheres, but then there's also their vitality, which doesn't fully unite with them. Like I said, above our pay grade. But that's why the Alter Rebbe says Yednika. That's what the Alter Rebbe says is suckling. They don't get real vitality because they're in rebellion. They're in denial of their own source. They're klipa and sitra achra, and therefore they are not truly alive. But they are technically alive. They're technically alive, but not truly alive, which is a state called suckling. Right? Or as the Mashpiyim used to say in Yeshiva, are you alive because you're alive, or are you alive because you haven't been hit by a truck yet? Very profound statement. Anyway. Masha Kasov B'Zayar Chadash. Now we have the last section of the chapter. This is the section that was not originally in the handwritten original, but was added by the Alter Rebbe for publishing, apparently. Masha Kasov B'Zayar Chadash. This that it says in the Zayar and the Zayar Chadash, the new Zayar, Sha'ikr, two different Sfarim, I believe, Sha'ikr Talishi Kaddish Atzmei B'Shas Tashmir Stavka, which says that the main quality of the godly soul of a child depends on the self-sanctification of the parents at the time of their union, at the time of the conception of the child, specifically. Unlike the children of the Amei Haaretz, the children of the ignorant who don't know how to conduct themselves properly and with sanctity at the time of the child's conception, right? It says in the Zohar that those children receive lesser souls, right? So this is at its face, and we'll maybe get into a little some more wrinkles, maybe a little more depth in this. But at its face, the end of the chapter is like this. The Alter Rebbe is going to ask a rather straightforward question. We're going to answer the question. That's what's happening. The question is a question a student might bring up on what we've said the rest of the chapter. What we've said through this whole chapter is that the quality of a person's godly soul is essentially completely in the hands of God. Right? God chooses. God chooses whether you take the express train from Atzilus down to here and have a very sensitive, godly soul, very awake and very aware soul that's aware of godliness, or whether you hit every branch on the way down, right, and you become very insensitive and lacking in awareness of God, right? That's all determined by God. God is the one who's running the differentiation process, the centrifuge, right? And so to speak, there's nothing that that would affect it or that can affect it, because fundamentally God is choosing the nature of how a piece of himself is manifest in the world. A very profound thing. The Zohar seems to say something slightly differently. Just a slight question on the issue, which is that the sanctification of the mother and father at the time of the conception of the fetus, which is the time when the soul just begins to be drawn down into the world, right? That time, their thoughts and intentions and holiness at that time determines the quality of the soul of the child. So which one is it? Is God determining through the divine centrifuge, right? Especially since, as we've said, even the lowliest person is fundamentally, their soul is still a piece of God, right? Whereas the Zohar seems to imply that if your parents are much holier, you get a much holier soul. But if your parents are ignorant, right, then you get something much lesser, right? So how is that possible? We just finished saying that every soul is literally a piece of God. So that's the question. Second here, pardon me. Let's read the Alter Rebbe's answer, the beginning of the Alter Rebbe's answer. Hainu, what the Zohar says, that the quality of the godly soul, or what it appears to say, that the quality of the godly soul is determined by the behavior during conception of the parents, their holiness, right, their spiritual state. Hainu, mishum she'en lecha nefesh ruach neshama she'en la lavush menefesh da'atzmus aviv ve'imah. This is the answer. The answer is because there is no soul, nefesh ruach neshama, there is no godly soul which comes down into this world, which does not have a garment from the soul of the very being or the very self of his father and mother, from his parents, right? In other words, Alter Rebbe's answer is going to be like this. The Zohar, when it discusses the quality of the divine soul that's drawn down based on the parent's behavior, is not talking about the soul itself. That's the answer. The answer is, the Zohar is talking about the levush. It's talking about the garment of the soul. More on that in a second. What do we mean by lavush? What do we mean by the word garment? Lavush, the word garment, is very common in Tanya. We're going to see it again in the next in chapter 3, and on many times. Lavush is a very important term, so we'll continue to discuss it in Tanya, in Chassidus in general. It's a very common term, a very common concept. Because you have a lavush, you have a garment. It's used to describe the soul. It's used to describe it by metaphor. It's used to describe various aspects of godliness. It's a common Chassidic idea. What do we mean by garment, right? Fundamentally, what we mean by garment, when we say a levush, right? And there's also the concept of hislavshus, of in clothing, which is a very poor English translation on its own, unless you already know what it means, but whatever. What we mean by a garment, really, fundamentally, is we mean an interface. That's really what we mean by a garment. The function of clothing is twofold and opposite. Right? Clothing, on the one hand, is to conceal something that others are not meant to see. And in the very act of concealing, it nevertheless reveals. It nevertheless reveals at least the superficial or the appropriate for other people to see contours, aspects, personality of the persons. Clothing serves as an interface. It's like a bridge, right, between two incommensurate or two worlds that otherwise couldn't interface, right? The classic example of the levush and the easiest metaphor is the physical body itself, right? The soul, even the animal soul, which as we discussed in chapter 1, is spiritual, not physical, right? Even the spiritual vitality of the body, the animal soul, right, requires a body to interact with the world. The world and spirituality do not interact. If I want to move this cup, which for various reasons God deems is very important, that it be possible to move a cup, right? Because if you can move a cup, then you can drink it. Which God must see as very important because he brings the soul down and gives it a body. Spiritual soul cannot move this cup. Spiritual things do not affect physicality. Right? The spiritual and the physical are two incommensurate worlds, in other words. You can have spirituality can go on and try and affect the physical all day long. They're non-intersecting planes. What do you need to make one be able to affect the other? You need an interface. You need a bridge, right? And the bridge is called the body. The body is able somehow, in a way that's ultimately quite mysterious, really, be a vessel for the spiritual and convey, on the one hand, conceal the spiritual, because the fact is that if anything spiritual was wholly revealed in the physical, it couldn't move the cup. Right? It has to do a massive act of concealing the spiritual and yet let through the will of the spiritual, the actions of the spiritual, all the ways we're familiar with using our body, right? Such that it can affect the outside world. So the body is the levush, the body is the garment, it's the interface. It's what its purpose is to allow a higher thing to express in a lower place, right? When higher and lower are defined, are defined strongly. In other words, when we say higher, we mean higher and it can't be lower. And lower is defined as lower and it can't be higher. How do you interface between how do you connect the two things? You need a levush, a garment, an interface, a body. That's what a levush is. That's what a garment is. So, plugging that back into Tanya, the godly soul, every godly soul comes with a garment, right? Fundamentally, it's a little bit, I ran into this preparing the class, a little bit tricky, but I think the fundamental idea is as follows. The godly soul is fundamentally an interior being. In other words, the godly soul as a piece of God, that's what it is, right? Fundamentally, God is very, you can use all our big English words, the Israelis aren't here, right? God is fundamentally very solitudinous. God fundamentally is alone. There's much Chassidus written about this. In fact, God is fundamentally alone even after the worlds are created. Discusses this in chapter 33 of Tanya. God is absolutely alone. A piece of God is also absolutely alone, right? By nature, it has the nature of the thing that it's a piece of. That's part of what we mean by it being a piece. And see all those earlier classes on that concept, right? So, the godly soul fundamentally is not really for interacting, right? As by nature, it's not really, there's no interacting. It's self-contained. It's not it's like my Hasidic teacher when I was first in yeshiva used to tell us, it's like godliness is like a diamond, right? So a plumber could use a diamond to stuff a pipe, and a kid could use it to play marbles, and a cubicle worker could use it as a paperweight. But none of that is actually what a diamond is for. What is a diamond for? The answer is for being a diamond. That's what a diamond is for. It's not for something, right? If it's for something, the second you use it for something, you already are degrading it, lowering its value, right? Not appreciating it, right? Some things have inherent fundamental worth. Their worth is self-contained into be. That's what godliness is like. The godly soul is the same. So fundamentally, by its own power, the godly soul per se, right, does not have interaction with anything. And what the tricky part is to realize that this means not just things which are below it, like when we say the spiritual interacting with the physical is a higher thing interacting with a lower thing, right, so to speak, but even things which are above it in a sense, right, even to connect to levels of godliness outside of itself, so to speak, right, or holier things or other things like that. You could read it a different way, I guess, and say everything is below the godly soul. I don't know, a below to or below or external to. I don't want to overcomplicate things. This is something the teacher of the class has to figure out for himself when he's preparing, and not figure it out live in the class. But fundamentally, what we're going to say is that the godly soul has no interactions, either in holiness or in the mundane, without this garment. The garment is what allows the godly soul, to the interface that the godly soul has, that it's able to interact externally in any way at all. This garment, the quality of this garment, we're going to talk a lot about, right, in a moment. The quality of this garment is determined by the parents. That's what the parents contribute. It is from the very spiritual nature of each parent that this garment for the godly soul is formed. In other words, the quality of the godly soul's ability to receive and give to others, right, to others in the broadest sense, right, to interact outside of itself in any way, really, is all determined by the spiritual quality of the father and mother. But this is not what the godly soul is at all, right? And here we see a very interesting thing, because at the end of chapter 2, bizarrely, and I didn't really see this read anywhere, this occurred to me preparing the class, you see a very similar connection to the end of chapter 1. In fact, I see a direct through line, because the whole point of the end of chapter 1 is that being a good person does not make you Jewish. The two concepts are unrelated. Basically, is what we discussed at the end of chapter 1, right? You can be a good person, a spiritual person, a person devoted to God, right? We said a klipas nega, which knows God, says, I am only for God. That's the statement of klipas nega, right? But it's still klipas nega. It's still a concealment of godliness, right? In its own way. Right? Whereas the divine is totally separate. It's not something you can achieve. You can't good person your way to godliness. The two things are incommensurate categories, right? So what's interesting is that here the Alter Rebbe speaks again about the incommensurability of these two categories, right? Here at the end of chapter 2. And the Alter Rebbe added this for printing. I don't know why, but it's interesting that here at the end of chapter 2, you have the same discussion again. The whole question is the question beneath the question, which we're always trying to suss out in this class, we're always trying to find, right? I think the question beneath the question is if you just spent this whole chapter telling me that the godly soul is literally a piece of God, and you won't back down from it, okay? There's all other complications, and it expresses in different levels, and so it needs people to bring out the expression, etc., etc. But ultimately, what is it? It's a piece of God, right? There's no backing down from that statement, right? The question is, but how then can it have any practical ramification whatsoever, right? Because the person will be thinking halfway through second chapter of Tanya, well, it sounds nice, but when have I ever run into God himself in day-to-day life lately, right? In other words, it's literally a piece of God, but in a way, isn't that defining it into irrelevance in a way? Right? Now, of course, if you understood how the Alter Rebbe sees God at this point, you would understand that it's impossible for God to be irrelevant. But that's a separate issue. In other words, coming at this purely from an Advaita standpoint, I think the question beneath the question is how are you now going to tell me, for all the chapters you're going to tell me about it, the practical ramifications of the godly soul? Isn't ultimately a piece of God? Doesn't that mean if it's going to be a piece of God, it has to be beyond, transcendent, unaffected by the goings-on of this world, unable to affect the goings-on of this world, right? Because it's totally beyond, right? It's totally beyond this place. On the other hand, if it does, as we're going to start immediately in the next chapter, beginning to see, if it does interact with this world, affect this world, and is affected by this world, which is really the question from the father and mother's behavior, right? And their sanctity, which is they seem to, the Zohar seem to say they affect the soul, right? So then can it really be a piece of God from the other direction? That's the question. That's the question. The question is how can it be absolutely godly and yet absolutely practical at the same time? It seems a contradiction, right? And the answer is it's not a contradiction because the way God has made the Jew, the way the Jew's inner constitution is, the way their souls are added together, as we'll discuss in a second, the way we're built is that the godly soul remains absolutely godly, but how does it affect the world and is able to be affected? Because it has a levush, because it has a garment. So the garment is absolutely critical, in other words. The garment doesn't mean, when we say something is a garment, we're not demoting it really. On the contrary, we're saying it's absolutely vital because it's the go-between, right? The garment is what we can work towards refining. The garment is what the parents, through their sanctity, can give you a better one and a clearer one and a more effective, a more godly one, right? The garment is what allows the godly soul to enter into the world and affect the world. It's what allows it to receive blessings and receive sustenance from on high. All interactions that the godly soul is having externally come through this garment. And that's how we're able to explain the godly soul is a piece of God, literally. And yet it's practical because the way it is made and the way its garment are made is that they fit each other. And in a strange way, this end of chapter 2 of Tanya, which is kind of like, I don't want to say, really I'm just speaking of my own ignorance really when I say this, but is kind of like a little niche of Tanya that's not particularly cited a lot or discussed a lot, these last few lines of chapter 2. It's not like a big headline, famous section of the Tanya, but in a way, you can almost see how it's setting the groundwork for everything that's to come. Just as chapter 1 led very logically into chapter 2, I can see very clearly how chapter 2 leads logically into chapter 3, because the whole notion of what it means that the godly soul interacts through a garment is fundamental to the Alter Rebbe's understanding of the world and the Alter Rebbe's understanding of Judaism, right? The way Tanya understands Judaism and the way Tanya understands a Jew and mitzvahs and Torah and all of these other things is, as we keep saying and keep returning to as the theme of Tanya, is pnimius, right? Is inner reaction, inner interaction, inner truth. Don't tell me what the thing is technically or how it relates. Tell me what it really, truly is on the inside, right? The truth, the reality of the thing from the inside. How does this connect to the concept of the garment? So I'll take you through it one step at a time. This garment, it says in Maimarim, the other Rebbes of Chabad explain these lines of Tanya. And it's really needed to explain other lines of Tanya which happen much later, but we'll take the opportunity and talk about it now. They take the opportunity to introduce a somewhat mysterious and less talked about thing in Chassidus, although it's all over the Maimarim. You know, everything in the Maimarim is an open secret because it's all a question of how much you learn the Maimarim, right? It's a Farbrengen in its own right. You know, is it such a secret if every Rebbe is trying to tell you it in their Maimarim? The answer is it's only a secret if you don't learn the Maimarim. That's what makes it a secret. Anyway, there is a concept in Chassidus called the Nefesh HaSichlis. There's a third soul. You may have heard this concept before. There is a third soul described in Chassidus. The two mentioned explicitly in Tanya are much more well known as part of the Alter Rebbe's system. However, as you can see from right here, right, and this is how the Rebbeim understand the Tanya, right, the third soul is also mentioned and implied in Tanya, and it's implied even stronger later in Tanya as well. You have the godly soul, the Nefesh HaSichlis, which is the second chapter of Tanya. You have the Nefesh HaBahamis, which is the first chapter of Tanya, the animal soul, / the Nefesh HaTivis. There's different names, and the precise subtleties of the applications of the names are beyond the scope of our class, although they are different. They're not all exactly the same. But you have the animal soul, the natural soul, the vital soul. That's all the first chapter. So you have animal soul and godly soul, right? There is a third soul. The third soul is called the Nefesh HaSichlis. Nefesh HaSichlis means the intellective soul. It comes from the word seichel, intellect. Nefesh HaSichlis means the intellective or intellectual soul. I'll explain what that means in a second, because I can hear the questions arising as to what that could possibly mean. There is debate. It's not clear, or it's complicated in the Memarim. It's complicated across the Hasidic discourses, whether the Nefesh HaSichlis should be viewed as its own whole third soul, which is one way, or whether to view it as part of the broader Nefesh HaBahamis, which is a different way. Frankly, the second way is much easier for me to understand, so I'm going to explain it as best as I can, as best as I understand it, according to the second way, where it's part of the Nefesh HaBahamis, although I don't really think that the two are necessarily in contradiction. I think, as with many things in Chassidus like this, I think that if you really study it and really understand it well, which I can't say I have, you would see that really it's all talking about the same thing. It's just different. It's different ways of understanding it, different ways of looking at it. Anyway, this is often the case. The Nefesh HaSichlis is the intellective soul. Right? At the end, in a way, we've already met the intellective soul. We've already met the Nefesh HaSichlis. Because if you remember back to the end of the first chapter of Tanya, where we were discussing the Chassidei Umas Ha'ilam, the righteous among the nations, right? And we were discussing how those who keep the 7 Noahide laws are not like the idolaters described at the end of Tanya, who have only evil, but are rather like Klipas Nega, are rather like a Jewish animal soul, as we were discussing at the end of chapter 1. And we discussed how it's very interesting that there's a concept of idolater versus righteous among the nations, because in fact, in some important ways, you can move between the categories without any sort of conversion process. There's no process. It's all automatic, right? Even though we're discussing it as switching between types of soul, really, right? Because one is Shalosh Klipas HaTameis, it comes from the 3 impure Klipas, whereas one is from the Klipas Nega, the translucent Klipa, right? So in other words, we're actually discussing a metaphysical change, but a metaphysical change that does not come with the sort of with the sort of ritual necessarily, and process that turns one from a non-Jew into a Jew, right? We discussed all this at the end of chapter 1, if you recall. That distinction, really, between Chassidei Umas Ha'ilam and the idolaters and the Akam, the Chav Mazalis, the difference between them is really fundamentally the difference between the Nefesh HaSichlis and the Nefesh HaBahamis. Because if you think about it, the intellective soul and the animal soul, because you have to think about it like this. If a person is trapped in being an animal soul, how can they escape the lower nature of the animal soul? In other words, how can someone, and we say, in Tanya, we say non-Jews, most people only have an animal soul. They don't have the godly soul, which, as we expressed at the end of chapter 1 of Tanya, just explains how little we use our godly soul, because of how little practically we see a difference between them. That's all that shows, right? So if you're within your animal soul, there's obviously still, as Tanya itself discusses, a process of spiritual improvement, right? Even within the animal soul itself. But the question is if the animal soul is as we discussed in the first chapter, is midos be'ikr, is be'ikr midos, is primarily emotional, right? How can the animal soul ever step out of its own desires and its own self enough to improve, to grow, to truly transform, right? To go from being a only I, which, as we've said, was the lowest idolatrous manifestation, is the spiritual root of the Gimel Klipas HaTameis, is only I. Only I. I'm the only, right? How do they transform from that to I am, which is a much more neutral statement, which we say comes from the Gimel Klipas HaTameis, that's like the Jewish animal soul, or the soul of the Chassidei Umas Ha'ilam, the righteous among the nations. That transformation can be accomplished because, and really I'm not telling you anything you don't know already, every human being is born, every healthy human being is born with the capacity for abstract, objective intellect. Abstract, objective intellect. The Nefesh HaSichlis, the intellectual soul, is the animal soul's capacity, its highest capacity, its intellect, where it is able to step outside of right? Its lowest egotistical impulses, right? Now, I just want to, are you with me so far? That's the first thing to check. I just want to clarify that when we say step out of its egotistical impulses, it never reaches the godly soul. In other words, there's a firm line, and that's really what we're discussing ultimately in chapter 2 of Tanya. There's a firm line, right? And the firm line is, as I've defined it for you so far, should be very clear, because the godly soul is God saying, I am, right? The animal soul, the Nefesh HaSichlis, the highest it can go is, I am totally devoted to God. In other words, when we say that an intellectual, a person, a regular animal soul, right, with no involvement of the godly soul, can raise itself up and live a much more spiritual existence, and I think Chassidus would even say can live an incredibly mystical existence in communion with God to a large extent, right? How it, the furthest extent it can ever go is, I am totally devoted to God, according to Chassidus, in Chassidus' view. That is the ultimate. There is no escape of the animal soul of the fundamental basis of its nature. No matter how high or how devoted to God it becomes, its nature is separation from God, right? Saying I am is a denial that only God is, as we discussed at great length in chapter 1. It's fundamentally a denial, even if it's a denial with no thought towards denying God, right? To even say I am is fundamentally a denial of godliness in a profound sense. Therefore, the Nefesh HaSichlis can only ever go so high. However, the height that it can reach, although it can never reach the level of the godly soul, the height that it can reach is very, very great. Right? The pure abstract intellect is the basis, the Alter Rebbe would tell you, for the deepest and most passionate and most profound religious yearnings, understandings, and relationships with God that people have all over the world, right? This just further should cement for you the idea that when we talk about the godly soul in Chassidus, we're talking about something else entirely. We're talking about a totally Jewish issue that has nothing to do with regular religion, advancement towards God, spirituality, even mystical approaches to religion, mystical approaches to godliness. All of that fundamentally is built into the abstract intellect, right? A more spiritual person is a person who is able to step out of the animal being, who is totally motivated by their own animalistic desires and totally unable to see the true reality of things, right? As all the world's great philosophies say. In fact, basically the fundamental beginning of all philosophy is really this realization, right? That the world which presents itself to the senses is not all there is. There's something more fundamentally, right? There's an understanding of the world. I don't just accept everything that I see for a given.
Where's the interface?
1 second, getting there, not yet. 1 second. So, the Nefesh HaSichlis is fundamentally the abstract intellect of the animal soul, right? It actually says, the Mittler Rebbe says in the Siddur with Chassidus, the Mittler Rebbe says, it's actually a Pesach Maimer, that this is what's called the tselem. When God says man is created in God's image, right? Chaliv Adam shenivra b'tselem, favored is man, for he's created in God's image, right? The image, the tselem, which is under discussion, right? The image is actually the interface between the animal soul and the godly soul, which is interesting. Neither one of them. It's the interface, it's the go-between, right? Which in other places in Chassidus is called the Nefesh HaSichlis, is called the intellective soul, the third soul. What do we mean when we say abstract objective intellect, right? One thing we definitely do not mean is practical know-how, right? Like someone says, for example, I'll use a totally random example. Someone says, for example, Elon Musk must be a genius, right? And fundamentally, I don't disagree, right? Very successful businessman, et cetera, and you could say that's all public persona, but there's a genius of managing public persona as well, et cetera, right? You say fundamentally, someone so successful has to be brilliant, right? Chassidus would say, brilliant he may be, but the seichel, the intellect we are discussing, when we say the Nefesh HaSichlis, right, that is not abstract, objective intellect. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about know-how, right? Know-how, knowing how to do something, right, is much lower and much more fundamentally yoked to the ego of the animal soul, right? It's all about self-advancement, self-survival, self-extension, it's all very, very generally overtly self-centered, right? Of course, we say that the intellective soul itself must always, to some extent, be self-centered, but where exactly you draw the line is an interesting question. I don't know. But more fundamentally, when we talk about the intellective soul, we're talking much more about philosophy, deeper knowledge, abstract, impractical knowledge, the knowing of truth for its own sake, we might even say. Right? The knowing of truth for its own sake is the fundamental ability of the intellective soul, and every human being could do this. The more someone knows the truth for its own sake, and the more someone pursues the truth for its own sake and makes that the center of their life, the more spiritual the person is. And I have to tell you that fundamentally, when we in our current culture, there's a terrible silliness that's in our current culture, which I believe in retrospect, like 100 years from now, people might look at it as one of the craziest things that we used to believe, right? In our current culture, which is still trying to shake off the influence of very radical and very wrong 19th century Enlightenment ideas, which never had much substance to them in the first place, but for some reason we're still trying to shake them off. In our culture, intellect and spirituality are seen almost as opposites, when in fact, in actual reality, and as Chassidus would tell you, and as every world religion would tell you as well, really, fundamentally, all the old ones anyway, intellect and spirituality are almost identical. They're almost the same thing, right? The spiritual and the intellect are fundamentally united. In other words, when we say objective abstract intellect in the Nefesh HaSichlis, you shouldn't make the mistake, the rationalist mistake. You shouldn't make the limited modern day assumption that when we say intellect, we mean something like performing calculations, right? Or winning arguments or something like that necessarily, right? When we say abstract objective intellect, we mean fundamentally all of the soul's higher spiritual powers, is really what we mean. The animal soul has the capacity which is a fundamental human capacity, and really this is what makes a human being not an animal. It really is, right? We had when I used to learn Tanya with Uri Kaplun, I was the editor of the translation of the lessons in Tanya in Jerusalem. So we used to go to him for Tanya class. He used to say that what's the difference between a cow and a human being? He says there's only one difference between a cow and a human being. A cow, when it looks at the grass, thinks grass. A human being, when he looks at the grass, can still think whatever he wants. That's fundamentally the difference between a cow and a human being. That's the only difference, right? This ability to not be defined by inputs and outputs of the senses or the desires of the body, but to be able to step back from them somehow and say, here's all the inputs and outputs, but I can still attach myself intellectually or by choice to whatever I want. That's fundamentally what makes us human, right? It's our apartness, our aloofness from the regular system of cause and effect, which was what an animal is, and fundamentally that's a very modern idea, is to view an animal as simply a bundle of causes and effects, although that's fundamentally really what an animal is, right? A human being is not defined by inputs and outputs. A human being is not defined by whether external inputs and outputs from the world or internal inputs and outputs from the body, right? A human being is able to stand apart from that. And that is what the Nefesh HaSichlis is. The Nefesh HaSichlis, and you see immediately when you understand it like this, how it's a spiritual concept. The Nefesh HaSichlis is to the stepping into the self-contained self, apart from all of these other things, to be able to weigh and to view things from the outside, right? Objectively, as it were. Objectively, see it as it is rather than how it relates to me. An animal sees everything how it relates to me. A human being can see something as it is, which is why I said earlier, pursuing the truth for its own sake, right? So when we say abstract objective intellect is Nefesh HaSichlis, we mean That includes the highest spiritual pursuits. That includes a person saying, I'm not just going to do what's easy, but I'm going to do what's difficult. I'm going to commit myself to a higher ideal, a higher purpose, a higher spiritual calling, a more spiritual life, a more refined life. All of these things are all possible by dint of the Nefesh HaSichlis, even without the godly soul. By dint of the intellectual soul, and that's why, of course, Tanya would never deny that you have non-Jews who raise themselves up to the absolute heights and the absolute highest levels of refinement, spirituality, etc., as the righteous among the nations, right? So, now we get to interface. All of that being said, that's all the capacity of the animal soul. The animal soul has the ability to do all of that. So when you think of the three souls within the person, right, the way to think of them is not side by side. In other words, it's not godly soul, intellective soul, animal soul. That doesn't capture the relationship. The way you should think of them is layers, right? They're layered. The animal soul, at its deepest point, if you go into the panimius, as the Alter Rebbe would tell you to, if you go into the inside of the animal soul, past all of its superficial behavior and past all of its wants and desires, which where it's blown to and fro by the wind, and you go to its deepest place, if you go to the deepest place of the animal soul, what do you find? The Nefesh HaSichlis, the intellective soul. And if you go the deepest place within the Nefesh HaSichlis, what do you find? In a Jew, you find the kli, the vessel for the godly soul, right? An example of this, for example, the way the Rebbe would often put it in Sichas, the way the Rebbe would describe it, is that the seichel, the intellect, the mind, the abstract intellect which we're discussing, has to know that the basis of the intellect is beyond the intellect. I'll say it again. The mind has to understand on its terms that the basis of the mind is beyond the mind. Right? For example, in other words, that abstract intellect, which allows the highest spiritual understanding and the highest spiritual accomplishments, has to be able to recognize that there are some things which are simply beyond its capacity. In other words, it has to know that a human being is a finite being, no matter how refined, no matter how spiritual. They're a finite, limited being, and their finite, limited self will never be able to reach God on its own. And the mind can logically understand that. There's no reason why you can't understand that principle, right? Very similarly, and to take it from a less, how do we put this? A less overtly religious phrasing, which some people find more difficult. We'll put it in a more abstract terms, right? All systems of reason, all systems of abstract reasoning, even the highest spiritual pursuits, right, realize that fundamentally they're based on faith, right? All the systems of mathematics are based on axioms which cannot be proven, right, etc., etc. All of philosophy as well, and all of these different things that fundamentally underlying all of these systems and these deep spiritual commitments that a human being can have, the mind recognizes that it has its own limits. It recognizes that at the basis, behind, underlying all of its knowledge and all of its attachment and all of its, what we would call in Chassidus, all of its tam, all of its tuv tam, all of its good taste in the intellectual sense, and all of its bina, all of its analysis and understanding, there lies the unknown. There lies the not understandable, the non-analyzable, the transcendent. The mind, Chassidus would argue, and does argue in other Maimarim and other places, the mind, the Nefesh HaSichlis, on the inside is hollow. At its deepest place, it has a receptacle, it has a kli kibble, it has an empty vessel where it's able to receive from the godly soul. And what does it receive? It receives the basis of intellect, which is faith, tshuva, which is repentance, which is also fundamentally connected in a way I can't explain right now. You have Kabbalah soul, you have acceptance of the yoke, you have, I said tshuva, emunah, Kabbalah, Mesiras Nefesh, you have self-sacrifice, right? All of the things which Tanya describes as the infinite capacities of the godly soul, the unique capacities of the godly soul in its own way. All of these things exist in a way in the animal soul as well, but in the godly soul they exist in a totally different form, a totally transcendent form. And the godly soul is directed towards and able to bring these things down to the extent that they can form the basis for intellectual understanding. Right? In other words, faith is brought down into knowledge. Faith is brought down into understanding. There's an interaction there. Faith, even though faith is, it's a bit paradoxical, but even though faith is defined as that which transcends knowledge, right? Nevertheless, knowledge is aware of faith, and faith is aware of knowledge. And in the middle there, somewhere, one is able to become the fundamental basis for the other, right? And so too with tshuva, repentance. So too with tshuva. When we talk about repentance in this context, the mind fundamentally, when it gets stuck, right, is fundamentally about things that already exist, forms as I understand them, structures and systems as I already understand them. Tshuva, repentance, is the idea that there's always a way to transcend that structure, right? To go beyond that form and become pure again, which the mind itself understands. The mind itself understands and can understand the highest spiritual place of the Nefesh HaBahamis, understands well that at some point you just have to let go. You have to let go of your previous structures, your previous systems, your previous understandings, and this is fundamental to tshuva, right? So too for self-sacrifice, which is in a way the ultimate, as discussed in chapter 18 and 19 of Tanya, is the ultimate contradiction between the animal soul and the godly soul, because the godly soul wants nothing more than to cease to exist, whereas the animal soul is I am. That is what the animal soul is, right? So but even self-sacrifice, right? The mind of the animal soul, the deepest spiritual yearning of the animal soul, understands a little bit the concept of self-sacrifice. It's willing to sacrifice itself for things that it understands, for self-extension, to become a greater I am, which means it's able, in some sense, at least to receive from, through the intellect, the concept of the divine soul's I am, right? So this whole long speech, what's the point? The point is that the deepest point of the Nefesh HaSichlis, you have the Nefesh HaSichlis. I would like to point out an interesting little side fact. Interesting little side fact is that when there are Maimarim that discuss how even the animal soul just by itself also has an etzem beneath the Nefesh HaSichlis, which is maybe in a way an even deeper place where it relates to the godly soul. What's its etzem? What's itself? It's very much like the etzem or the self at the deepest point of the godly soul. It says, what's the difference between them? I don't really know what this means, but I'll share it with you. It's interesting. It's mysterious. The difference between them is that the godly soul's deepest self is connected only to God, whereas the animal soul's deepest self is free to connect to whatever it wants. That's fundamentally the difference between them, which is interesting. I don't know what it means exactly. Anyway, the point is, the three souls are in layers. Animal soul, the deepest point of the animal soul is the Nefesh HaSichlis. The deepest point of the intellective soul of the Nefesh HaSichlis is the godly soul, and within the godly soul continues to infinitude because it's literally a piece of God, right? The Nefesh HaSichlis is the levush, is the garment. It's an interaction, it's an interface. It lets the godly soul interact with the world naturally through the Nefesh HaSichlis. In other words, the godly soul doesn't just break out and go do things on its own. Where do you see the influence of the godly soul? The influence of the godly soul is seen usually in the way that it comes down through the Nefesh HaSichlis, it's the way the mind grasps things, or if you prefer, to use a very fancy term, right? It's the meta-rationality of the animal soul, right? It is the way the animal, if you want to see how the godly soul affects us, you have to look at how the animal soul, you have to think about how the animal soul thinks. That's where the change is. The change is affecting the way the animal soul thinks in its deepest sense, right? Because it all comes through the Nefesh HaSichlis. Okay, that's my long spiel on the Nefesh HaSichlis. Let's finish the chapter, please. We're running a little late. We are... V'chol mitzvahs, about 7 lines up from the end of the chapter. V'chol mitzvahs she'eseh, every mitzvah that a Jew does, hakol al yidei eseh halavush. Its godly soul does those mitzvahs through this garment of the intellective soul. V'afilu hashafesh she'eseh levin hashemayim hakol al yidei lavush zeh, and even the blessings it receives from heaven all come through this garment. V'im yikadesh es atzmei, which I assume we mean spiritual blessings, spiritual livelihood for the godly soul, its spiritual sustenance. And that is when, if a person sanctifies themselves, they'll draw down a holier garment for the soul of their son. Right? This is what the parents affect. The parents affect the interactive node, the interface, the go-between, which affects the clarity of transmission between the animal soul and the godly soul. That's what the parents affect. And even if it's a very holy soul, it still requires the father's sanctification. In other words, if the garment is bad, it doesn't matter how holy the soul is, because it can't affect anything, right? In general. So in other words, the garment is very important, which is why the Zohar, if you go there, is behooving you to behave yourself correctly and sanctify yourself at the time of conception, and that way you'll greatly help the soul of your child. By the way, it's explained how can the garment of the godly soul come from the parents if the godly soul comes from God? And you see now the answer is that it's not really of the godly soul, it's really of the animal soul. When you say the Nefesh HaSichlis is part of the animal soul, that explains how it can come from the parents. It comes from the spiritual nature of the parents, so it actually makes perfect sense. Straight from the Nefesh HaBahamis of the parents to the Nefesh HaBahamis of the child. It's directly, they receive their direct spiritual succor from the state of their parents. Fine. However, in the quality of the soul itself, we see that sometimes the soul of a very lofty person, an infinitely lofty person, can come down and be the son of a very lowly man. Right? In other words, we see that fundamentally the parents do not affect the quality of the child's godly soul itself, because the godly soul itself comes from God and God chooses. So it doesn't matter, even if there's no way that his parents were sanctifying themselves correctly, as the Zohar would tell them to do at the time of conception, the son can still have a very lofty soul, right? It's only the lavush, it's only the interaction that's affected. As the Arizal writes, all of this, I believe most of these lines are direct quotes from the Arizal, as the Arizal writes in his Sfarim. Thank you very much, everyone. God willing, next week, chapter 3, we begin. Chapter 3 next week.